The glass towers of Morrison Industries scraped against the Seattle sky, housing one of the most prestigious tech companies in the Pacific Northwest. On the 37th floor, the executive boardroom buzzed with nervous energy as 12 department heads waited for their new CEO to arrive. Hiroshi Tanaka had been flown in directly from Tokyo, handpicked by the Japanese parent company to turn around the struggling American subsidiary. Margaret Chen pushed her cleaning cart quietly along the marble hallway, her rubber-soled shoes making no sound against the polished floor. At 62, she had been cleaning these offices for 8 years, moving through the corporate world like a ghost, invisible to the executives who passed her without a glance. Her gray uniform and weathered hands told the story of a woman who had spent decades in service jobs, someone the business world had trained itself not to see. The morning meeting was supposed to start at 9 sharp, but it was already 9:15 and tensions were rising. The American executives shuffled papers nervously, whispering among themselves about layoffs, restructuring, and the uncertain future of their departments. None of them spoke Japanese, and rumors had circulated that Tanaka spoke limited English, preferring to conduct business in his native language with translators present. Margaret continued her methodical cleaning, dusting the conference table and emptying waste paper baskets, while the executives pretended she wasn't there. She had perfected this invisibility over the years, learning that powerful people often said their most revealing thoughts when they believed no one important was listening. At 9:20, the boardroom doors opened, and Hiroshi Tanaka entered with 2 assistants. He was younger than expected, perhaps 45, with an intense gaze that seemed to catalog everything in the room instantly. His perfectly tailored suit and confident bearing marked him as someone accustomed to command, but there was something else in his expression, a carefully controlled frustration that Margaret recognized from years of observing workplace dynamics. "Good morning," Tanaka said in heavily accented English, his words precise but limited. The executives mumbled their greetings, some standing awkwardly, unsure of proper protocol. Tanaka took his seat at the head of the table and gestured for his assistants to distribute thick folders to each person present. Margaret continued cleaning, moving to dust the credenza behind where Tanaka sat, her presence so routine that no one thought to ask her to leave. "These reports," Tanaka said slowly in English, "show problems, big problems." The silence that followed was heavy with anxiety. Regional Sales Director James Morrison cleared his throat. "Sir, if I may, the market conditions this quarter have been particularly challenging, and we've implemented several cost-cutting measures." Tanaka raised his hand, stopping Morrison mid-sentence. His jaw tightened, and Margaret could see him struggling with the limitations of conducting such a crucial meeting in his second language. The nuances he wanted to express, the subtle points that might make or break careers, were getting lost in translation. Suddenly, Tanaka pushed back from the table and stood, his frustration finally boiling over. He began speaking rapidly in Japanese, his voice rising with each word, his hands gesturing emphatically as he paced behind his chair. The executives exchanged helpless glances. Even with the general tone, it was clear that Tanaka was angry, disappointed, perhaps even furious about what he had discovered in the company's operations. But the specifics, the crucial details that might help them understand how to respond, were completely lost on them. Margaret paused in her dusting, her cloth frozen mid-motion as Tanaka's words washed over her. His Japanese was fluent, educated, the language of someone who had attended the best universities and moved in sophisticated circles. But more than that, his frustration was heartbreaking. He was trying to save a company, trying to preserve jobs, and he couldn't make these people understand the urgency of the situation. "The waste in this company is criminal," Tanaka was saying in Japanese, though the American executives heard only unintelligible sounds. "Every department is bleeding money while the managers make excuses. The Tokyo board is ready to shut down the entire American operation, but I convinced them to give me 6 months to turn it around." 6 months! And these people sit here like they're discussing the weather instead of fighting for their survival. He slammed his hand on the table, causing several executives to jump. "The sales projections are fantasies. The marketing budget is being spent on executive perks while customer service has been cut to nothing, and half the staff are updating their resumes instead of working. Don't they understand that 700 families depend on this company for their livelihood?" Margaret looked around the room at the confused faces, at good people who were about to lose their jobs because of a communication breakdown, and made a decision that would change everything. "Excuse me," she said quietly, her voice cutting through Tanaka's continued Japanese monologue. Every head in the room turned toward her. The executives looked shocked that the cleaning lady had spoken at all, while Tanaka stopped mid-sentence and stared at this elderly woman in a gray uniform who had just interrupted the most important meeting of his career. Margaret took a deep breath and responded in perfect, formal Japanese. "Tanaka-san, perhaps I could help translate your concerns to your American colleagues. I believe there may be solutions they could offer if they fully understood the situation." The silence that followed was deafening. Tanaka's mouth fell open, his eyes wide with disbelief. The executives looked from Margaret to Tanaka and back again, trying to process what had just happened. The cleaning lady spoke Japanese. Not just spoke it, but spoke it with the refined accent and honorific language patterns of someone who understood business culture. "You speak Japanese?" Tanaka asked in his native language, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Margaret replied, still in Japanese. "I lived in Kyoto for 15 years. My late husband was stationed there with the Navy, and I taught English at Doshisha University while raising our children. I understand your frustration, and I think I can help these people understand what you're trying to tell them." Tanaka slowly sat back down, studying Margaret with new eyes. Here was someone who could bridge the gap he hadn't been able to cross, who could help him save not just the company, but the hundreds of jobs that hung in the balance. "What did she say?" James Morrison asked nervously, looking between Tanaka and Margaret. "What's happening?" Margaret turned to face the room full of executives, these people who had walked past her for 8 years without ever wondering about her story, her background, her capabilities. For the first time in nearly a decade of working in this building, she had their complete attention. "Mr. Tanaka is trying to save this company," she said clearly, her voice carrying authority that none of them had ever heard from her before. "The parent company in Tokyo is planning to shut down the entire American operation because of massive financial losses and mismanagement. Mr. Tanaka has convinced them to give him 6 months to turn things around, but he's been struggling to communicate the urgency of the situation." The color drained from several faces around the table. This was worse than any of them had imagined. "He's not here to fire people," Margaret continued, translating as Tanaka nodded approvingly. "He's here to save jobs, but he needs complete honesty about what's going wrong and real solutions, not excuses or attempts to shift blame." Regional Manager Lisa Park spoke up first, her voice shaky. "What specific problems has he identified?" Margaret turned to Tanaka, who began speaking in rapid Japanese while she listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. The executives watched this extraordinary exchange, seeing their cleaning lady transform before their eyes into a skilled interpreter and cultural bridge. "Mr. Tanaka says the sales projections for the last 3 quarters have been consistently inflated by about 30%, Margaret translated. "The marketing department has been spending money on trade shows and corporate events that generate no measurable return on investment. Customer complaints have increased by 60%, but the customer service department was downsized instead of strengthened. And most critically, employee morale is so low that productivity has fallen 20%, while salary costs have remained the same." The executives shifted uncomfortably as each point hit home. These weren't vague criticisms, but specific, data-driven observations that exposed the depth of their problems. "But," Margaret continued, "Mr. Tanaka believes these problems can be solved if everyone in this room commits to complete transparency and radical changes in how business is conducted." Thomas Wright, the chief financial officer, leaned forward. "What kind of changes?" Tanaka spoke again, and Margaret translated. "First, all financial reporting must be completely accurate, even if the numbers look bad in the short term. Second, every department must justify its budget with measurable results. Third, customer service becomes the top priority, even if it means temporarily reducing profits. And fourth, executive perks and bonuses are suspended until the company returns to profitability." "Those are significant changes," Morrison said carefully. "Some of our contracts and compensation packages." Margaret listened as Tanaka responded, then translated with a slight smile. "Mr. Tanaka says that you can renegotiate your compensation packages with the unemployment office if you prefer. The choice is simple: adapt or close." The bluntness of the statement, delivered through Margaret's calm translation, had more impact than if Tanaka had struggled to say it himself in broken English. There was no room for misinterpretation, no diplomatic softening of hard truths. "I have a question," said Jennifer Walsh, the head of human resources. "How do we rebuild employee morale when people are scared about job security?" This time, Tanaka smiled before answering in Japanese, speaking directly to Margaret as if she were his trusted advisor, rather than someone who had been invisible moments earlier. Mr. Tanaka says that in Japanese business culture, when a company faces crisis, the leaders take responsibility publicly and make personal sacrifices to show their commitment to saving everyone else's jobs. He suggests that all executives take immediate pay cuts, that you hold company-wide meetings to explain the situation honestly, and that you implement an employee suggestion program where good ideas are immediately implemented and credited to their creators. Margaret paused, then added her own observation. "In my experience working here, the employees know the company is in trouble. They're not stupid, but they've been kept in the dark about how serious it is and what role they can play in fixing it. People want to help save their jobs, but they need to be asked and they need to be trusted." For the next 2 hours, Margaret facilitated the most productive meeting Morrison Industries had held in years. She translated not just words but cultural concepts, helping the American executives understand Japanese business philosophy, while helping Tanaka appreciate American workplace dynamics. They developed a 60-day action plan that addressed each of the critical issues Tanaka had identified. More importantly, they established a communication framework that would allow ongoing collaboration between the American team and their Japanese parent company. As the meeting concluded, the executives filed out in small groups, talking animatedly about implementation strategies and timeline. For the first time in months, there was energy in their voices. Hope instead of resignation. Tanaka remained seated as the room emptied, studying Margaret with undisguised amazement. When they were alone, except for his assistants, he spoke to her in Japanese. "I must ask you something that has been troubling me since you first spoke. You clearly have education, cultural knowledge, language skills that qualify you for executive positions. Why are you working as a cleaning lady?" Margaret smiled, an expression that was both sad and wise. "After my husband died 10 years ago, I needed work immediately to support myself. I was 62, considered too old for most professional positions, and my 15 years in Japan weren't seen as relevant business experience by American companies. This job provided steady income and health insurance. After a while, I discovered that being invisible had its advantages. People say remarkable things when they don't think anyone important is listening. But surely now, after what happened today." "Now," Margaret said thoughtfully, "I suppose things will be different." Tanaka stood and bowed formally, a gesture of respect that acknowledged Margaret not as a subordinate but as an equal. "Would you consider accepting a position as my cultural liaison and translator? This company needs someone who understands both cultures, who can help bridge the communication gap that nearly destroyed everything." Margaret looked around the boardroom where she had been invisible for so many years, then back at this man who was offering her a chance to step out of the shadows and use skills she had thought were no longer valued. "I would be honored," she said in Japanese. The next morning, Margaret arrived at Morrison Industries not with a cleaning cart, but with a briefcase and a nameplate for her new office. As she walked through the halls, employees who had never noticed her before stopped to stare, word having spread quickly about the cleaning lady who spoke Japanese and saved the company. But the real transformation wasn't in how others saw Margaret, it was in how she saw herself. For 8 years, she had accepted invisibility as the price of financial security. Now, at 62, she was discovering that it was never too late to step into the light, to use her voice, to matter in ways she had almost forgotten were possible. In the weeks that followed, Margaret became an invaluable bridge between two cultures, two business philosophies, two ways of understanding success and failure. She helped implement the changes that saved Morrison Industries, but more importantly, she helped create a workplace culture where communication flowed freely, where problems were addressed honestly, and where every employee felt their contributions mattered. The CEO had spoken in Japanese, and only the cleaning lady had responded. But in that response lay the power to transform not just a company, but the lives of everyone who worked there. Sometimes the most important person in the room is the one everyone assumes isn't important at all. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected source, spoken in a language that bridges not just words, but worlds. Margaret had spent years being invisible, but when the moment came that truly mattered, she had the courage to step forward and be seen. And in being seen, she reminded everyone that every person has value, every voice deserves to be heard, and every individual carries within them the potential to change everything. 6 weeks after that transformative meeting, Morrison Industries was unrecognizable. Margaret's new office occupied a corner of the 37th floor with windows overlooking Elliott Bay, a far cry from the supply closet where she used to store her cleaning cart. But the real changes went deeper than office assignments and business cards. Every morning at 8:30, Margaret and Tanaka held what they called bridge meetings, where department heads could raise concerns, share ideas, or request clarification on company policies. What had started as a necessity due to language barriers had evolved into the most effective communication system the company had ever implemented. The customer service metrics for this week show a 15% improvement in resolution time, reported Jennifer Walsh, scrolling through her tablet. The employees are responding well to being able to escalate issues immediately instead of going through 3 layers of approval. Margaret translated for Tanaka, who nodded approvingly before responding in Japanese. Mr. Tanaka says that empowering frontline employees to solve problems immediately is not just good business, it's respectful of both the customer and the worker. He's pleased that the American team is embracing this philosophy. Lisa Park raised her hand tentatively. I have a question about the new marketing budget allocation. Some of the trade shows we've been attending for years are being cut, and I'm worried about losing industry connections. Quote, Margaret had learned to anticipate these concerns and had already discussed this topic with Tanaka. Mr. Tanaka understands your worry, but he asks you to consider this. How many actual contracts have resulted from these trade shows in the past 2 years? The budget analysis shows that the money spent on booth fees, travel, and entertainment could instead fund a customer retention program that would yield 3 times the return on investment. But the industry relationships, Lisa began, are important, Margaret agreed. Which is why Mr. Tanaka proposes that you maintain those relationships through smaller, more targeted meetings with key clients. Instead of hoping to meet new prospects at expensive trade shows, focus on deepening relationships with existing customers who already trust the company. Thomas Wright looked up from his financial reports. The numbers are definitely improving. We're ahead of projections for the first time in 8 months. But I'm still concerned about the parent company's expectations. Tanaka spoke directly to Thomas in English, his language skills having improved dramatically since Margaret began coaching him during their daily sessions. Tokyo is surprised, good surprised. They expected more problems, not solutions so fast. Margaret smiled at his progress. Every afternoon, she and Tanaka spent an hour working on business English, but more importantly, they discussed the cultural nuances that could make or break international business relationships. She had taught him that American employees responded better to direct praise than indirect criticism, while he had helped her understand the Japanese concept of long-term thinking that prioritized sustainable growth over quarterly profits. After the morning meeting, Margaret walked through the office floors, something she now did daily to gauge employee morale and identify potential issues before they became problems. The atmosphere was dramatically different from 2 months earlier. People made eye contact, smiled, seemed engaged with their work, instead of simply enduring it. She stopped by the customer service department, where Maria Santos, a young woman who had been with the company for 3 years, was training 2 new hires. How were the new systems working? Margaret asked. Maria's face lit up. It's amazing, Mrs. Chen. For the first time, I feel like I can actually help customers, instead of just taking messages and transferring calls. Yesterday, I resolved a billing issue that would have taken a week under the old system, and the customer was so grateful she asked to speak to my supervisor just to praise my work. And how do you feel about the language requirements? Margaret had suggested that customer service representatives learn basic Japanese phrases for dealing with their parent company's executives and Japanese clients. I love it, Maria said enthusiastically. My grandmother spoke Spanish, and she always told me that each language you learn opens a new world. I never thought I'd have the chance to learn Japanese through work. Margaret felt a warm satisfaction hearing this. She had convinced Tanaka to offer language bonuses for employees who achieved conversational proficiency in Japanese, and the response had been overwhelming. 15 employees had enrolled in evening classes, seeing it not just as a career advantage but as personal enrichment. Later that afternoon, Margaret was reviewing quarterly reports when her assistant knocked on her door. Mrs. Chen, there's a woman here to see you. She says she's your daughter? Margaret looked up in surprise. Susan lived in Portland and rarely made unplanned visits to Seattle. Send her in, please. Susan Chen Martinez entered the office tentatively, clearly impressed by the elegant space, but uncertain about how to react to seeing her mother in such an environment. At 38, Susan was a successful attorney, but she still saw Margaret primarily as the woman who had cleaned other people's offices to put her through college. "Mom, this is incredible," Susan said, looking around at the awards on the walls, the view of the city, the conference table where Margaret met with executives. "I mean, I knew you had gotten a new job, but this is very different from what you expected," Margaret finished gently. Susan sat down across from her mother's desk, still seeming dazed. "I got a call from my old law school friend, Jessica Wu. She works for a consulting firm that specializes in international business. She said Morrison Industries has become a case study in successful cross-cultural management, and that the key figure is someone named Margaret Chen, who transformed the company's communication structure." Margaret poured tea from the service she now kept in her office, a gift from Tanaka's wife during her visit from Tokyo the previous week. "Jessica is very kind to say that. Quote, 'Mom,' she said, 'you're being invited to speak at business schools. That Fortune magazine wants to interview you for an article about overlooked talent in the workplace.'" Susan's voice carried a mixture of pride and confusion. "How did this happen? I mean, I know you're smart. I know about your time in Japan, but you thought those days were over for me," Margaret said without reproach. "You thought I had accepted my place in the world." Susan nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "I'm ashamed to admit it, but yes, when Dad died and you took the cleaning job, I thought you were just surviving until retirement. I never imagined you were capable of something like this." Margaret reached across the desk and took her daughter's hand. "I didn't imagine it either. For 8 years, I told myself that I was content with invisible work, that I didn't need recognition or challenge. But I was lying to myself. I was just afraid to try and fail, afraid to hope for something better." What changed? A man spoke in a language I understood, and I realized that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply respond when others cannot. I had knowledge, experience, and skills that were needed, but I had convinced myself they weren't valuable because no one had asked for them before. Susan was quiet for a moment, processing this. "I've been thinking about my own career lately. I'm a good lawyer, but I feel like I'm just going through the motions. Billing hours, making money, but not really making a difference." Margaret smiled. "And now you're wondering if there's more?" "Yes, seeing what you've accomplished, how you've helped this company and all these people, it makes me want to find work that matters beyond just a paycheck." Before Margaret could respond, her phone buzzed with a message from Tanaka. "I'm sorry, but I need to handle something urgent. The parent company executives are arriving from Tokyo tomorrow, and there's been a miscommunication about the presentation format." Susan stood to leave, but Margaret held up a hand. "Actually, would you like to see how this works? Your mother in action?" Within minutes, Margaret was on a conference call with executives in Tokyo, translating not just words, but explaining cultural expectations for the following day's meeting. She coached the American team on proper greeting protocols while simultaneously advising the Japanese executives on which topics would resonate most effectively with their American colleagues. Susan watched in amazement as her mother seamlessly shifted between languages, mediated cultural differences, and solved problems that could have derailed the entire visit. This was a side of Margaret she had never seen, a professional competence that had been hidden for years behind the uniform of a cleaning lady. When the call ended, Susan was shaking her head in wonder. "I feel like I'm meeting you for the first time." "In many ways, I'm meeting myself for the first time too," Margaret admitted. "For years, I defined myself by what I had lost, what I could no longer do. I forgot that experience and knowledge don't disappear just because circumstances change." That evening, Margaret and Susan had dinner at a restaurant overlooking Puget Sound, their first meal together as equals, as two professional women rather than mother and child. Susan spoke about her growing interest in international law, while Margaret shared her plans for expanding Morrison Industries' cultural exchange program. "I have an idea," Susan said as they finished dessert. "My firm has clients who are expanding into Asian markets. They're always looking for cultural consultants. Would you be interested in some freelance work?" Margaret paused, considering the offer. 6 months ago, she would have declined automatically, assuming she wasn't qualified or that no one would take her seriously. Now, she saw it as another opportunity to build bridges, to use her skills in service of understanding. "I'd be very interested," she said. The next morning brought the arrival of 3 senior executives from the Tokyo headquarters, including Tanaka's supervisor, Executive Vice President Yoshida. Margaret had been preparing for weeks, coordinating not just translations but cultural orientations for both sides. As she stood in her office, reviewing the final details of the day's agenda, Margaret caught her reflection in the window overlooking the city. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the invisible cleaning lady who had pushed a cart through these same halls just months earlier. But the real change wasn't in her tailored business suit or the confidence in her posture. The real change was in her understanding of her own worth. For 8 years, she had believed that being overlooked meant being powerless. She had accepted invisibility as her permanent condition, convinced that her knowledge and experience were relics of a past that no longer mattered. But when the moment came that her unique skills were desperately needed, she had found the courage to step out of the shadows and speak. The CEO had spoken in Japanese, and only the cleaning lady had responded. In that single moment of recognition and response, Margaret had discovered that being underestimated was not a limitation, but an opportunity. Her years of invisible observation had taught her how organizations really functioned, while her multicultural experience had given her the tools to build bridges others couldn't even see. Now, as she prepared to facilitate one of the most important meetings in Morrison Industries' history, Margaret realized that the true treasure had never been in being seen by others. It had been in finally seeing herself clearly, understanding that every person carries within them the potential to change everything, if only they have the courage to speak when their voice is needed most. The cleaning lady had found her voice, and in doing so had reminded everyone that the most powerful person in any room might just be the one everyone assumes isn't important at all.